For some of us to wake up, we need a wake-up call. The latest research in epigenetics says that it's the environment that signals the gene. Genes are like Christmas tree lights. They're turning on and off all the time. Genes make proteins, and proteins are responsible for the structure and function of your body. The expression of proteins is the expression of life. But if you're interpreting your environment the same way every single day, you're thinking the same thoughts, demonstrating the same behaviors, living by the same emotions, you keep the same genes on and the other genes off. Throw in the hormones of stress, which really downregulates genes to create disease. Then the question is, if the environment signals the gene, and the end product of an experience in your environment is called an emotion, if you live by the same emotions every single day, your body's believing it's in the same past environmental experience over and over again, and now you're headed for a genetic destiny. So then, can you signal the gene ahead of the environment? And the answer is absolutely yes. Because when you begin to embrace an elevated emotion and you combine it with a clear intention, and you're totally in the present moment, your brain and body don't know the difference between what's going on out there and what's going on in here. Your body believes it's in some experience in the external environment that's producing that emotion. And all of a sudden, the stronger the emotion you feel from an inward process, the more you pay attention to the thought or the image in your mind, you're creating a long-term memory. And all of a sudden now, you begin to downregulate the gene for disease, and you begin to upregulate the gene for health, and that gene begins to make a new protein, and that protein begins to make a new hormone or a new chemical or an expression of something, a new chemical that's going to begin to affect other systems in the body. Acute conditions. Our medicine is so great for acute conditions. You break your arm, you have appendicitis, you're not going to go to an acupuncturist, you're going to get immediate care. Chronic conditions require a lifestyle change, which means you have to start making different choices. You got to start examining the way you live your life and the choices you make and the thoughts you think and how you manage your emotions. And so the beauty behind all of this is that just like an infection spreads amongst the community and creates disease, once people start breaking through and they wrap their mind around this, health and wellness can be as infectious as disease, and we're seeing it happen. And placebos, just so you know, range from working anywhere from 10% to 100%. Imagine that. So in a depression study, as an example, 83% or 81% of the people in a depression study that are given a placebo heal as well as the people that are given the actual antidepressants. There's brain scans to show changes in their brain before and after. It means then they're making their own pharmacy of antidepressants by thought alone. And it took them 6 weeks, 8 weeks of taking that placebo every single day. Now this is an important point because most people think, oh, I did the exercise or the meditation once and my conditions should go away. Well, even in the depression study, 6 to 8 weeks of taking a placebo. Every time they take the placebo, they remind themselves that they're going to get better. They change their emotional state. Sooner or later, that becomes their new state of being. It may take people 6 to 8 weeks of doing the work every single day where they start noticing significant changes in their health. So we have to go from philosopher to initiate to master, from thinking to doing to being. And once you get to that point where it now becomes innate in you, becomes who you are, then you've memorized an internal state independent of the conditions in your external environment. That's when you begin to master your environment or master your life. I'm starting to realize how conditioned we are into believing how limited we are. And as you start peeling those layers away and you break through those beliefs, those self-limiting thoughts and emotions, on the other side of that is where the miraculous happens. I think this is a time in history where it's not enough to know. And because of technology, we have access to so much content. And information creates awareness. And awareness is consciousness. And in an age of information, ignorance is a choice. There's an energetic change, I think, that's taking place in the world right now where people are so informed that old models, old paradigms are beginning to break down, whether it's the medical model or the religious model, the education model, journalism, the economy, politics, it's all beginning to come to the surface because something else has to come out. And 10 years ago, information was the thing that stimulated thought, stimulated new ideas. And as we learn new things, we make new connections in our brains. So as we begin to add new stitches into that three-dimensional tapestry in our mind, we're beginning to cause our mind to function in new ways. But the key then is to apply it. You just got to understand the formula. And just like any skill or anything you learn, you got to go from thinking to doing to being. You got to take knowledge, you create the experience, and if you keep doing it over and over again, you start getting a skill, or you start getting wise about how to do it. And you know that you know how to do it. In the last 10 years, we have assembled a scientific team. And let's see if you can really make significant brain changes. I don't want those changes to just be in your mind. I want them to be in your brain. I want to be able to see before and after pictures to say, that person has a significant change after a traumatic brain injury, or anxiety or depression, or a cyclic mood disorder, or a stroke. We want to see that there's been significant change. At the same time, let's measure your brain in real time, and let's look to see what that transformation process looks like. We gained so much knowledge about what that transformational process looks like. In other words, I can tell you without a doubt that if you're analyzing your life right now within some disturbing emotion, that 100% of the time you're going to make your brain worse. If you're stuck in an emotion and you're thinking within that emotional state, in other words, you can't think greater than how you feel, that means then you were thinking in the past, because those emotions are a residue of the past. So we see people in the process of change that are analyzing in duality or polarity. That kind of drives the brain into higher states of arousal and further away from true change. So we've done thousands and thousands and thousands of brain scans, and we now know that there's a formula to create greater brain coherence, greater brain efficiency, to make your brain work better. And when your brain works better, you work better. At the same time, it requires a clear intention and an elevated emotion to begin to change your energy and to change your life. And nobody changes until they change their energy, right? So then how do you get a person out of resentment, frustration, into joy and freedom? Why would they feel grateful or joyful or free if the experience hasn't happened? So most people are spending the majority of their life waiting for something out there to take away their emptiness or pain or the resentment in here. Well, if they're waiting their whole life in separation or lack, then and we create reality, then the lack is driving certain thoughts, which is creating more separation and more lack. So teaching people then to begin to condition their body emotionally before the evidence takes place in their life is breaking a significant habit. So instead of living by cause and effect, now we're beginning to cause and effect. So the moment you start feeling whole and grateful, we now know your healing will begin at that moment. The moment you start feeling worthy and abundant, your wealth is coming. You're generating a certain amount of energy, a certain amount of wealth. And so let's stop telling the story of your past and let's start telling the story of your future. And people who aren't defined by a vision of the future, for the most part, are left with memories of the past. And your brain is a record of the past. It's an artifact of everything you've learned and experienced to this moment. So most people wake up in the morning and they start thinking about their problems. And those problems are memories that are tattooed in the brain that are associated to certain people and things at certain times and places. So the moment the person wakes up clean slate, they start thinking about the problems they're thinking in the past. If you believe your thoughts have something to do with your destiny, well, there's a possibility that your past is going to be your future. Every one of those problems has an emotion associated with it. So then the moment you start recalling the problem, you start feeling unhappy. Now your body's in the past, because thoughts are the language of the brain and feelings are the language of the body, and how you think and how you feel creates a state of being. So people reaffirm their identity based on the past, right? And it turns out that the redundancy of doing that, conditioning only requires an image and an emotion. And most people are unconsciously conditioning their body into the familiar past, into the known. So now if you're in the familiar past and in the known, you're going to crave the predictable future, right? That's the known as well. And there's only one place where the unknown exists, and that's the eternal present moment. That's the sweet spot of the generous present moment. So you gotta labor to get that person beyond the emotions that keep them tacked or anchored to the past. And yes, It takes an effort to do that, but if you keep working with the formula, you'll reach that elegant moment where there's a liberation of energy. And now your body, as the unconscious mind, the objective mind is not believing it's living in the same past experience 24 hours a day, because you're liberating the body from that emotional state. So you ask a person, why are you so unhappy? Why are you so frustrated? Why are you so resentful? The moment you ask that, their brain is going to associate that emotion to a past event. That's because they have nothing to look forward to in their future. So if you're not being defined by a vision of the future, it just means to me that you're more in love with your past than you are with the future. So how do you teach people to believe in a future that they can't see or experience with their senses yet, but they've thought about enough times in their mind that their brain is literally changed to look like the event has already occurred? The latest research in neuroscience says that's absolutely possible. We know that. And how do you teach a person to select a new possibility in their future and begin to emotionally embrace that future before it's made manifest to such a degree that their body, as their unconscious mind, is believing it's living in that future reality in the present moment, and they're signaling new genes in new ways ahead of the environment. Now, till their body begins to change to look like the event has already occurred. We've proven. So your body is believing it's living in that future reality in the present moment. Now think about this. The stronger the emotion you feel from some condition in your life, the more altered you feel inside of you, the more you narrow your focus on the cause, and the brain freezes an image and takes a snapshot. And that memory now is embossed in the brain. It's branded in there. So then people think neurologically within the circuits of those past experiences, and they feel chemically within the boundaries of those emotions. And the stronger the betrayal, the stronger the trauma, the more the body's living in the past, right? So how do you reverse that? So now, if you truly got passionate about a future, we've all done this. You get a wild idea in your mind and you start holding on to that vision and you're preoccupied with it. All of a sudden, the thought in your mind becomes the experience, and you start feeling the energy of the future. Now, the stronger the emotion you feel from that vision, the more you're going to pay attention to the picture in your mind, and now you're remembering your future.
And vice versa, the stronger you pay attention to the feeling of the past, pain, you're going to create the pain in this moment.
Exactly. So then it requires a coherent brain, and we now know that there's a formula for that, and we've got beautiful research to show that people can do it. They just have to practice. And it requires a coherent heart. It just requires getting still, closing your eyes, putting your attention on your heart, changing your breath so that you move into the present moment. And when you slow your breathing down, you slow your brainwaves down. When you slow your brainwaves down, now you're accessing your autonomic nervous system. So then you train a person how to open their heart and feel an elevated emotion. And it takes a little practice. And just like a flower that takes time to bloom, trading the resentment, the frustration, or the impatience for gratitude, appreciation, and thankfulness, and you keep at it, there'll come a moment where that system switches on, and now you're feeling grateful for no reason at all. In 4 days, we now know that you can change your genetic destiny if you just practice the inner work. See people with stage 4 cancer, with Parkinson's disease, with myasthenia gravis, with lupus, with MS, with brain injuries, with rare genetic disorders, with vertigo, tinnitus, kidney failure, all kinds of health conditions, come to a week-long event, and then at the end of that event, they make significant strides in getting beyond the emotions of the past. Now think about this. The science says that the environment signals the gene, that's epigenetics. The end product of an experience in the environment is an emotion. So as long as you're living by the same emotion every single day, you're signaling the same gene in the same way. And if that gene is related to a survival emotion, a stress hormone, then you're downregulating the gene and you're creating disease. So when the person trades that emotion and really breaks free from the chains of their past, and now they're feeling an elevated emotion, well, now they're dialing down the gene for MS, and they're upregulating the gene for health and balance. And so the person, you'll say to them, where's the disease? Well, I'm not the same person. I'm not this. And the side effect of that is a transformation and healing. So the funny thing about it is the person who has the healing is not talking about the healing. What they're talking about is how amazing they feel. problem is the moment you start feeling emptiness or lack, your brain is going to start to look for something outside of you to take it away. The problem is that normally the stimulation that's created from those outer things give the body a rush, and so the receptor sites in the cells recalibrate. So you need more the next time to turn it on.
I used to work in an Alzheimer's clinic when I was trying to get into medical school. And once in a while, these older folks, they would have dementia. Parts of the brains would literally wither, like the flesh would wither. It's not just the thinking and the electricity. And hidden painting abilities would come out. And I'm not talking like they're gonna be in a museum at some point, but a dramatic change in the way they wrote, in their ability to paint landscapes. And those kind of things make me think there's a lot of untapped potential. So those examples, when I take care of brain injured, it's not all sad cases. They can be phenomenal in some ways. And you learn that there's so much going on in the brain that we are not seeing on the daily level. So I think there's a lot of potential we haven't tapped into that we could if we structured things better. Anything difficult where you have to think is good for your brain. If you ask Usain Bolt, how do I get stronger legs? Run. It's intuitive. But the flesh in our skulls, it's meant to think and feel. And that is the power of self-growth. And it's a thinking machine, it's a thinking flesh that you actually have to use or to protect itself, because it's an energy hog, right? It's 3 pounds, but uses 20%. If you're not using parts of it, it'll program itself to let those parts of the garden wither. So the diversity of thinking and the depth of thinking, just one level past what you're used to, is the way to keep the whole garden flourishing. And it is a garden in there. There's chemicals, there are things moving, there are different types of brain cells. It's not just neurons. So I always try to give that metaphor analogy, if you will, that it's a garden and you have to irrigate it and stimulate and tend to all the corners, particularly the ones you're starting to neglect. Then the creative things happen. You don't just sit down and have them happen. You got to work and dream and go hard, and on top of that, something creative can happen. So now we have the understanding that the brain is meant to think. The brain is also meant to command your body to move. And absolutely, the minute you don't use your left hand, the right parietal lobe with the motor strip says, I'm not going to use much. I'll shave down that density of those brain cells a little bit. So that's where movement's important. And then the other thing is navigation. When you see old people and they lose their way home, well, that has a particular address also. Many things are global in the brain, but navigation is in the temporal lobe, and they have dementia in that area. Navigation also is spatial awareness is a function of the brain, and sometimes when we're on our phones too much, we don't have that. So my kids, I tell them, don't look down. Not religiously or adamantly, but try to just remember our route and just look up and see how far you can get. I think those habits will help us as we get less young. And those are practical things we can do during the day. And as far as the other element is brain training, it doesn't have to be some weird game that's not intuitive. I think brain training just means learning as a habit, one step past where you're comfortable. If you're reading and you know it, your brain's it's an idle. If it's too hard, it's not even engaged. I'm not even going to win this race. I'm not going to kick it in second gear. So just like video games, just good enough to get to the next level, right? They don't hit you with the 5th level, the tilt level up front. It's level 1 to level 2, level 2 to level 3. And that's what learning is. So despite your knowledge and intellect, it's just that level right beyond you that is brain training. So you don't have to buy an app. You just have to challenge yourself and think. Brain's a hybrid vehicle. It grew, it evolved through thousands and thousands and thousands of years of lots of food scarcity. You didn't eat all the time. And so it's got a backup mechanism called ketones. So after 16 hours, if you don't put glucose in and the liver's done releasing the glucose it's held onto through glycogen reserves, then it'll start burning fat. It'll clip off those oxygens and hydrogens, and they'll make ketones out of it. Intermittent fasting can also help you lose weight. I think that's why most people are interested in it. But it's the way the brain prefers to get its fuel source. And it's based on a diet lessons about dieting learned through controlling epilepsy and seizures in kids in areas where there's no medicine. Now, intermittent fasting is back and forth, glucose and then ketones, glucose and then ketones. But for kids, if you just get them almost nearly all ketone as the source that goes up to the brain through an all-fat diet, their seizure rates go down. You know, so that's proof that food changes mind. So this whole myth about you only use 20% of your brain, no, we use 100% of our brain, and pictures show that. But to get things done, we might only use 15, because efficiency is about ruts, like dominoes falling in a certain path. And the best way I can explain it is, as you grow, the brain, the way the electricity flows, the way the connections prioritize, is a bit like skiing down a mountain, creating these electrical grooves of sort, where if you see something, you see a cliff, fear, it goes down a certain path. And every time you do that and you've reinforced it, it actually becomes less expensive energy-wise to follow and fall into that habit. So these pathways, these habits in our mind, these rituals, these things that are good for us, we want to hold on to those, but a lot of them have become deeply carved, you know, routes down the mountain. And filling those in, bearing them, and finding healthier ones is going to be an energy expending process. The effort will be harder in the beginning, and then as you create a new route down the mountain, you can condition yourself to having more favorable and constructive responses. That's the best way I can explain is why effort will lead to change, and your most effort will be spent in the beginning, and then you can change your emotional and cognitive responses by conditioning yourself to find a different route down the mountain. Depression, OCD, and obesity, the drive to eat, it can all be modulated, and they're all housed near each other. That speaks to what they are, is an imbalance of the emotional drive with the ability for the frontal lobes to tamp down some of these instincts. It's instinctive to eat. Sometimes it can feel instinctive to be depressed. And sometimes obsessive compulsion is a part of our brain, and it's a natural part of our brain. It's okay to have those feelings. When you have them too much, the imbalance isn't just electrochemical in those emotional hubs. It's the frontal lobes not accessing their potential to tamp down some of the emotions. That thinking of creating new habits, creating new values, creating less triggers in your life, that's the opportunity that we all have. And I think that's the project you're working on. What's the stuff we can control without zapping ourselves and without putting pills in us? Those things set the boundaries, but the frontal lobe regulation of how we feel is in your own command. Thought can change how fast your heart beats. Why wouldn't we believe that thought can change those subcortical structures about anxiety and depression? If you get depressed, you're sort of, you can get stuck. But people who aren't having those mental health issues, but just want to be better and live a more rich life in the sense of personal experience, we can think about our lives and our habits and triggers and create effects inside us. The mind-body connection is mind down to body. And many people feel, body back up to mind, and that's where meditation and meditative breathing come in. It's not a simple one. It's not a quick fix. It's not gonna be a bullet. It actually takes work. You mentioned repetition. It takes work, it takes effort, and there is no shortcut to it, but it's a glacial change that can happen over a few months to a few years. And I think once, like people go to the gym, they can't not go to the gym anymore. I think people who find these rituals and habits that make them feel better, they become addictive to that, and they're constructive and they're not pharmacologic. You exercise and it releases it, it showers itself. The brain says, hey, I'm feeling good, this is good, I like this. I'm gonna create a new rut. I'm gonna remind you feel good when you run. The brain will shower itself with growth factors. There are growth factors. The brain says, hey, the electrochemical balance is better with those. So I think that's where you get the runner's high. It's not just adrenaline. It's not, dopamine's a happy chemical. I'm jacked up, I'm on adrenaline. It's just such a complex ecosystem. And rather than feeling intimidated by that, to me, I just see opportunities on how people can, improve their lives. Changing what shows up on the counter is powerful. And if we ate less and if we ate efficiently and we did, it's a less carbon imprint, I think all of those things, it's good for the planet, it's good for us, it's mind and body, and then it's also communal. Then it goes to the next generation. It's not just something I did. And then I think it can perpetuate, so it's not just an individual thing.
400 years ago, the metaphor for the brain from the philosopher René Descartes was that it was like the nerves were like hollowed out plumbing, and currents moved up and down the nerves. And we still speak of currents, but now electrical currents. Then the model changed as we developed electrical machines to, something like a circuit board. But no one could conceive of a non-hardwired circuit board, so we started to think of the brain as hardwired. And now with a computer, people tend, in that master analogy, to think thought is something like the software and the brain is the hardware. But what we really find, if we just can speak about the brain on its own terms and not in terms of that metaphor, is thought actually can change the physical structure of the so-called hardware and its function. And once you realize that and dig into what the laws of that are, some very interesting possibilities arise. Because I'm a doctor, I started to look at what illnesses or conditions that people were suffering from could be changed. And part of that was to help those people, of course. And part of it was to test the idea. If it was really true, you should be able to change some illnesses. By the second book, I'm looking at some pretty substantial, severe neurological conditions and finding that they can sometimes be changed too. Not always, but sometimes, and sometimes radically. So it's a test of the concept. And at a certain point, the scales fall from one's eyes and you realize we've got a lot of things about the brain quite wrong. I talked about a girl who was born with half a brain and she's missing the left hemisphere, which we use to process language. And she, you would think she would be in the ICU with tubes in and out of her, but that's not the case. Her brain rewired itself, and she can speak, and she votes in elections, and she has her favorite basketball team, and so on. Now, that means that the brain is not nearly as localized, particularly the outer parts of the brain, for sure, as we thought, but even some of the deep parts of the brain. So think about that. What does that mean? That, thoughts that are not localized to modules. I think it's the most important change in our understanding of the brain in several hundred years. Everybody thought that the circuitry was formed and finalized in childhood. That gave rise to a view of human development, human potential, that taught people that you're stuck with what you're born with in a kind of absolute way. I mean, one case after another in my second book, people are told, your child will never get better, you will never get better, and so on. It's not possible. If you had a stroke when you were being born and you have cerebral palsy, that the assumption was that's it. If you tried to maintain your brain as you got older, that was seen as kind of a waste of time. But even if we're not talking in medical terms, your conception of what's possible, let's say in the second half of life, is radically altered when you understand that there's plasticity from cradle to grave. You can reinvent yourself in certain respects, take on skills you never dreamed that you could take on throughout the course of your life. That's an incredibly liberating thought. And not only can you, but if you don't challenge your brain, it probably won't maintain itself. So, the brain, just like the body, requires some intensive work just for maintenance. It's necessary to do that.
All the little lies that you tell yourself about yourself, the limitations, the belief systems that hold you back, they hardwire and they become real.
So there's really two kinds of pain. There's an acute pain, which tells you that there's damage to part of the body, and we don't welcome it, but it actually is essential for our survival. And some people who are born with a genetic tendency not to be able to feel pain, well, they tend to die very young because they'll hurt their foot, they won't notice it, and they'll die of an infection. Chronic pain is damage not only to the part of the body, but to the nervous part of the pain system itself. So what happened with Michael Moskowitz is he was a psychiatrist turned pain physician, and he had a number of mishaps or accidents. One of them had to do with a kind of a skiing accident, and so he wrecked his neck. Initially it hurt him just around the neck, but the nerve kept getting pinched over and over again. And so the brain got really good at registering that pain. And what was initially a kind of just a strong thrust of pain, lasting seconds, as the brain got better at processing it, the pain would last longer, and it started to spread from his neck to his head to his shoulders, and soon his upper back. And he was stuck with a chronic pain syndrome. Now, he started reading about plasticity at this time. And as a pain physician, he tried everything for that chronic pain. So he tried all the medications, which are problematic, to say the least. Nerve blocks, so injections into various nerves, and a lot of complementary things, all the ones he knew about. He was very open-minded, and nothing touched it. Most of us think that there's probably a pain center in the brain that registers all of this pain, but in fact, there's about a dozen different centers in the brain. And that's the first thing to know. But what's interesting about them is they're distributed through the brain, and they in general are dual purpose centers. So you may have noticed when you're in pain, you might be irritable and have emotional regulation problems, or you can't pay attention, or you can't do higher math. Now there's reasons for all of this. So one of the areas that registers pain also registers emotion. And what's happening there is the part, when you have acute pain, a small part of that area will light up. When it becomes chronic, about another 20% of that map will light up, and it literally invades the processing areas of emotion. So it's not as good at processing emotion. Plasticity is competitive within the brain. The same thing can happen to the attention areas and to visual areas. So what Moskowitz thought to do was, every time I feel that pain, I will visualize something. It didn't matter what he visualized, interestingly enough, to see if I can take back that part of my visual map that is being hijacked by pain. So he visualized 3 actual brain scans. One of the brain not in pain, so the pain areas are not lit up. One of the brain in acute pain, and so you'd have about a dozen areas that had little pinpricks of neuronal firing. And then one of the brain in chronic pain, and these pinpricks become supernovas. And he just imagined every time he felt any pain whatsoever, kind of dialing it back from supernova to pinprick to nothing. He does this several weeks, and he's always in pain, so he's always doing it, no result. By the end of, another week, he notices he's, got about 10 seconds free of pain. This is after years of pain. Not even sure it was right. By the end of several months, he's got 15, 20 minutes free of pain. By the end of a year of doing this every time it comes up, he's off all his pain meds, and he's completely pain-free. Wow. He's destroyed his chronic pain syndrome. In my first book, I describe people working with obsessions and compulsions, and it's a very similar thing. They have recurring thoughts that just won't go away, and they really have to know that you measure the success of that day by just thinking about how much effort you put into it, not whether the obsession or compulsion went away or the chronic pain went away that day. Because you're creating like a new gear shift inside your brain that's being built up from scratch so that you have conscious control over this to change it. And that takes a while. The mindset should not be conceived of as simply whether you've got a reward today, but you understand that to be a human being, to have a brain, is to be a creature that learns. And a lot of learning is incremental and slow.
What Dr. Norman Deutsch is talking about is that we often create limitations for ourselves that don't need to exist. We create boundaries around our mind and think that we are incapable of breaking them down. But that is just not true. Whether you want to overcome pain or replace bad habits with good habits, that is all possible, and it starts with retraining your mind. And you can start today. So comment down below just one simple task that you can do today to start retraining your mind.